Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar all about improving your landscape edits. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So we'll try and get through as many shots as possible. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping side of things. As usual, we have a maximum of 60 minutes today. We will probably use all of that up, I would think. With regards to recording, this is going to be recorded, so ignore any messages that might say it's not being recorded. It certainly is at source, and then that will be available to watch again tomorrow as well. You're very welcome to submit your questions at any time and also participate in the chat as you have discovered. Just to make you aware, the chat is public, so everything you write there everybody can see, so be nice to each other, of course. If you want to ask a specific question about today's webinar, it's much better if you do that in the Q&A section that you can see on your panel on the right hand side, and that will come straight through to me as well. I might also have a colleague joining me as well, so if you see a guy called Andre popping up, then he often pops in and helps with questions as well. If asking questions and chatting is not interesting to you, then that's perfectly fine, of course, and you can hide this window just by clicking the little down arrow on the right hand side, and that will give you a bit more real estate on screen as well. So without further ado, let us begin. Let's get started. So what we're going to look at is a bunch of landscapes, of course. Now it's unlikely we'll manage to edit all of these, but we try and get through as many as possible. Probably around 4 or 5 as usual is what we can manage in an hour. So we start off with some simple ones and sort of build up from there into something a little bit more complex. So that's the plan for today. All right, so let's go for this first one. Let's just hide me so we've got a bit more real estate and hide our browser. This is a shot from Taylor Burke. He's a photographer out in Canada, so hello Canada again, who recently was featured on our Instagram channel and was kind enough to give some images, though raw images for us to use. So my approach when I start editing, as if you've watched any of these webinars before, you would probably know, is that I tend to start with compositional facts, just so to sort of begin to visualize the shot, and that's going to be cropping and rotation. So my preferred way of doing that, of course, is rather than kind of going in and then cropping first and then rotating, what I tend to like to do is to use the rotation tool. So rotation and flip go into the box here, and I use my shift up and down cursor keys, and then I can just jog that a little bit. I just find that easier and a bit gentler to sort of visualize rather than trying to drag in the corner, which you can if you prefer that. Lots of people I know, if you're not being super critical, you can hover the cursor in the corner and then you can drag to rotate, but personally I find it much easier in that box. Okay, so let's just finish off cropping. I'm going to give a bit more of a panoramic look like so, and then hit H on my keyboard, and away we go. All right, I saw someone saying Q&A isn't accepting questions. It should be. If it's not, just throw it in the chat and we'll figure it out, so don't worry, John. All right, so next, before we get on to the fancy stuff of looking at local adjustments and so on and so forth, what I tend to do first is kind of get base corrections in terms of exposure and so on and so forth. So for this shot in particular, it's a little bit dark, but we have got the nice sort of atmosphere going on the top of the mountain here, for example. So I don't want to kind of destroy that, but it might be something we have to bring back later with a layered adjustment or local adjustment. It's also a little bit dark over here, I think too dark, so we want to do something about that and see if we can also improve the reflection so that's a bit crisper down on the lake at the front. So first of all, let's bring up our exposure a little bit and also our brightness. And if you don't know, the difference between brightness and exposure is that exposure is more of a linear sort of raise. So when you raise exposure, everything is going to get brighter. Shadows, midtones, highlights, the whole lot. If we just use brightness, then it's just the midtones. So I'm thinking about protecting the snow up on the top there. So I don't want to push the exposure anymore, but I could push the brightness a little bit more. So a few points there. And finally, let's open up some shadows as well. Now for me, I'm guessing this is early morning or late afternoon, and we've got the sun hitting the rock, as I said. So personally, I would prefer it warmer. So I'm going to push up the white balance a fair amount, like so. So now we've kind of dealt with our base exposure contrast to some extent, but really now we can start dialing in our clarity, because that's going to help it pop out a lot more. And potentially structure. So clarity, if you don't know what that is doing, is like a contrast adjustment, but it's really targeted towards the midtones. So when we play with our normal contrast slider over here, then of course that affects the whole image to some extent. So if I push contrast too hard, and I'm going to over exaggerate, then we're going to lose our shadow detail, and our highlights are going to be kind of unpleasantly bright as well. So we have to manage our expectations with this one. But clarity is a contrast adjustment which is just in the midtones. So it doesn't affect the shadows, doesn't affect the highlights. So we can be a lot more aggressive with that before we start to see image artifacts. Now equally in clarity we've got some different methods, and I think this shot would probably lend itself to a bit of punch, and that generally sort of does the same as natural, but it also ups the saturation to some extent as well. So if we switch to punch, I'd say if you watch here up on the rocks and I go to punch, and then that just gets that a little bit more saturated, which I think is nice. Now, if you wanted to, you could stop there, but I think we can improve it further, because I think this area on the left is too dark. It's kind of distracting, and also we could do a bit more to the reflection, but I also think I didn't quite rotate it enough. So let's go a little bit more, a few more clicks. I assume the water is level, unless it's some really clever water that doesn't stay level, so let's go for that. So first thing, let's dig into our layers, and we're going to make a gradient mask, which is a very simple digital adjustment, if you like. Very, of course, similar to having a filter which you would put in front of your lens, which has a graduated fall off on it. The benefit here, of course, is that we've got all the digital control, and we can really decide where this gradient starts and finishes, and how strong it is, and so on. So let's start by making a layer, and we're going to call this water grad, so I know what it's doing. Always good to name your layers so you know what the heck is going on. And let's choose a linear gradient mask here. So if we grab our cursor key here and draw up, we're going to end up with 3 lines. Now if I hold shift on my keyboard, it's going to keep them straight for me. So that's a handy little shortcut. Now when you draw a gradient, by default it's going to be, whoops, helps if you don't let go of shift at the wrong time. So let's straighten that back up. When you draw a gradient, by default it's linear. So that means if we look at the line at the bottom, this is where our mask will be the strongest. By the time it hits the center line, we're at 50%, and by the time we reach the bottom line or top line, depending when you started drawing, we've reached to 0. So that shows you your fall off. So now if I hit M on the keyboard, you can see what the mask looks like. So it has that gradual fall off. Now when my gradient mask cursor is selected, if I hover back on the shot, I can at any point go in and edit my gradient. Now the nice thing is, this particular shot, it doesn't lend itself to having this very graduated fall off. So I want to make it asymmetric. So if I hold my Alt key down again and click on this line, you'll see I can make the fall off much stronger, like so. So now if I take that away, we've still got 150 and 0, but that fall off from, if you like, the center line to the end is much harder now, because I just really want to affect this water area, but I don't want a hard stop, because then anything with a hard stop on a layer tends to look super obvious. Okay, so now I've got that gradient in place. What I want to do, I think it will look better if we add more clarity on this spot. So just to clean up the reflection a bit, because I imagine it's a tiny bit hazy. So if we look at that, just slight movement, and we turn off our water grad, then you can see before and after. So just a bit punchier. I could actually, shall we do punch as well? It's on punch, perfect. So if we go to natural, this ever so slightly is not as saturated as much. Okay, now the last thing that I want to do, I feel this is too dark here, so I want to open that up a bit. And you could say, well, just open up your shadows a bit more, David. But if we do that on our background layer, let's try it. So let's open them up. Kind of just ruins the rest of the shot. So now I can see into here a bit better, but the rest of the shot is looking a bit blah in that respect. So I'm going to compromise around there, because it is a sunrise or a sunset. Let's see what the timestamp says. It is, well, it says it's 1:15, but I'm a bit skeptical about that, unless it was in the winter. Winter in Canada, maybe the sun sits that low, I don't know. But I don't want it to sort of look false, if you know what I mean, by opening up all the shadows on the shot. So I just want to open them up a little bit here and maybe over here as well. So two ways to do this. We could start by drawing a mask and then opening up the shadows. That would work. Personally, I feel that is kind of limited with how much control you have. So what I prefer to do is kind of dial in the adjustment first and then moderate that adjustment using a brush with a flow control. So that all sounds a bit lofty and complicated, but it isn't really. So step one is to start with a new filled layer. So that's going to essentially make an adjustment layer. So I just hit M on my keyboard so we can see that it's a layer over the whole shot. So anything I do is going to affect the whole image. Let's just name this. I'm just going to call it Open Shadows. And we're going to go back to our shadow tool and do the same thing. Now I'm only concerned with what's going on here. I don't care it's affecting the rest of the shot, because we're going to affect that later. So I'm going to open them up till about this point, like so. So now I can think it's looking better here and perhaps over here a little bit too. Now I don't want that mask to be on the whole image. I just want it to be in certain areas. So I'm going to right click and say clear mask. Grab my draw mask brush. Back over to the image and right click and set my flow relatively small. So around 4 or 5 points. So this is a percentage value. So what it simply means is that every pass of the brush or mouse, if you're using one, it's going to give me 4% of my adjustment. So when I go back and forth, it's going to build up, in this case, 4% increments. If flow was set to 10, it would go up in 10% increments. So 10 brush strokes would give me the full adjustment. So the lower the flow, the more brush strokes you have, or mouse drags you have, to build up to your final one. So I'm going to go for around 4, and then I'm just going to brush here and then just open up those shadows where I think it sees fit, like so. Now it's not much, just a little, like so. So if we turn this off, because you might think, well, nothing happened, you crazy person. So if we turn this off, then you can see before and after. So just popped a little bit of light in there as well. Now actually, in hindsight, I was going to stop there, but I think this area, so like the snow and the mountain top, I think could be maybe a touch warmer. So I'm going to do the same thing, filled layer, and we're going to use our color balance tool, and we're going to throw in some warmth over the whole shot. like so, something like that. And now we're going to right click and clear the mask once more, and then grab my brush, and then I can just pop a bit of warmth back in, brush a bit smaller, snow trail over here like so. And once again, it probably won't look like much is going on, and maybe in these clouds like so. But if we turn this off and back on, it's just warmed that area up a little bit. Now, if you don't believe me, if we look at the grayscale mask for this one, then we can see where that mask is. So it's going to have greater effect where it's brighter. So where it's white is where it's masked, where it's black is no mask. And obviously anything in between, like the grey over here, that's kind of a lesser opacity, if you like. So it's going to have less effect. So there we go. I think that should do it for this shot. So where did we start? So if we want to see before and after, Alt key on your keyboard, click on the reset button. So that's how it came out of camera, and that's how it looks now. Without our layers, we can do an option click as well, and then see, okay, no layers. And then if I let go, then the layer's activated like so. So it just gives it that extra little 10%. All right, let's have a look at some questions. Yes, Jeff, it is being recorded. Everything is always recorded. So it's very rare that nothing is recorded, unless I make a complete mess of it, of course. But by default, everything is recorded and always goes back to the Learning Hub. So let's have a look at your question and have a look. Okay, any changes to tint as well as color balance? Not on this case. I think it was just more that I just wanted to warm it up. I think the tint was pretty much set okay. So no, I didn't really feel the need. And the color balance tool is a great way, as you saw, just for playing around with warmth or coolness. Like if we wanted to warm everything up back to the background layer, and I could actually consider it might look nice, a bit more golden like that. So I think I'd stop it there. Hardness for the brush. Yeah, so if we right click, that's essentially if the edges of the brush are, excuse me, circular, or if they feather out. So like the gradient, which had a fall off, the brush also has a fall off. Now, when you look at your brush, you will see just 2 circles. Now you're seeing 3 on the webinar because it enlarges the brush slightly so you can see it easier. It just has this weird effect with our adjustment brush. So you'll see 2 circles. The inner circle is 100%. The outer circle is where it's full, what's the word? Graduated off to 0. So you can see how it feathers. That's the word I was looking for. Peter says, when the layer mask is filled, would you invert the mask to have the same result as a clear mask? Yes, invert does the same thing if it's completely filled, of course. I'm using a tablet, so you can see my pen. You can use a mouse, of course, makes no difference in the final sort of result, but I find using a tablet and a pen is much, much easier for local adjustments because it's a more natural hand movement. I started using a tablet because I got RSI in my wrist from clenching a really badly designed mouse, and I just found it more comfortable using a pen. But now I use a pen and tablet for everything. I never pick up a mouse at all. I just find it much more comfortable. If you're interested in trying a tablet, it'll take you 24 hours of frustration to get used to it, and then you'll never look back, I think. Why not use the straighten tool across the water's edge? Personal preference, really. I tend to find when I use the straighten tool, if I don't get it bang on the horizon, I still need to adjust it anyway. So I just really cut that out and just jog it a little bit with the cursor tool. Layers you can use nearly for all tools, with the exception of film grain and black and white. Otherwise, yes, pretty much everything else works. Can I increase structure? Or should I have increased structure? Maybe. Let's have a look. We could actually, because it's a nice sharp shot. If the image is a bit soft, I'd probably avoid it. But as this has got good detail, must be a decent lens in play, then I would actually push this up a little bit, and if we were going to print it, that would benefit as well. So yes, it makes sense. And what about opacity, who was asking? Now, I don't find the need to use opacity at all now that we have flow. Before flow came along, opacity was useful because I would turn the opacity down to, say, 4 or 5, and then I would click drag for each stroke. But that's slower than using flow, because flow you can just paint, if you like, because it's a movement based adjustment. Now, I always have flow set to 100 because, sorry, opacity set to 100, because now we have an opacity in Capture One 12 for each layer. So if I go back almost as a final step and think, okay, did I overdo anything? Like, did I open my shadows too much? Then I can dial back the opacity here. And then you get your sort of ultimate control, like here for the opacity for the rocks. We could decide, or the water grad, I could go anything from 0 all the way to 100. So these days, opacity stays locked in 100 for me. I don't feel there's any benefit to changing that because I have a nice low flow, which I can stop when the adjustment looks good. My tablet is an Intuos Pro Medium, which is plenty big enough. They do a smaller one now, which I think is also plenty big enough. A big tablet is good if you're illustrating because you get more accuracy, but for our kind of work, you're going to be doing greater hand movements, so you might get more fatigue. But if you're doing fine retouching, a larger tablet can also help as well. But I think medium or even small would be perfect. All right, let's try the next one. Now, Jorn, when you said, when I add a new layer and try to change, nothing happens. If you add just a new layer, nothing will happen because there's no mask. So this is a new layer and I'm changing exposure and nothing's happening because there's no masks. But if I had a mask, like let's just draw a stupid circle in the middle, like that, and now I change, like so, then I am going to see a difference. So you need a mask on the layer for it to be able to actually do that. Okay, so let's get rid of that horrible layer and let's find another shot. Where should we go now? Let's do this one, because this one is trickier because it's kind of very underexposed, and often the danger is to think, oh, it's underexposed, I'm going to delete that. This is not from latest and greatest camera or whatever. I think it's a Canon 6D, so it's not like it's a Phase 1 IQ with 15 stops dynamic range, etc., or a Sony A7R with tons of dynamic range as well. So you might be tempted to think, this is no good. Not the case. Generally, anything in the past 4 to 5 years for etc., 4 to 5 years, camera model, there's pretty much enough dynamic range to be able to mess around and change everything. All right, okay, let's play around with this one then. So first of all, cropping wise, let's hit C on my keyboard and let's just bring that up a tiny bit, like so. And once again, our base kind of edits. We haven't played with the levels tool yet, but we're going to get to an image where we do need to use the levels tool. I'm not going to touch it here because if I bring in my highlight points, I'm going to start to blow out the sky details. And if I bring the shadows in, I'm going to block everything up. So I'm not going to touch levels for this image, probably. So first of all, let's raise our exposure. And let's also lift the brightness a little bit, and we need to get some of those highlights back in the sky, so it can be relatively aggressive with that, but not so it looks unrealistic. And a tiny bit of shadow lift. Now it's kind of a bit flat and dull and also too cold, I would think, so I'm gonna once again warm this up to something that's probably a bit more realistic, like so. And let's go for punch again, why not? And just boost up that mid-tone contrast somewhat. Now really the focus in the middle is this waterfall and this cavern. So I want to accentuate that a little bit. Now we could stop there, and that's actually a pretty good edit. But I think what would be nice would be just to brighten this area a bit, maybe make it more contrasty. Let's see. So what I'm going to do is add a new filled layer and just play, if you like. So that's a filled layer over the whole shot. Going to call this waterfall. And play, if you like, with a few edits or adjustments to see what would make this look better. So I want to make it warmer, so let's use our master tab and throw a bit more warmth in there. I also think we could add some more clarity, but let's just go back to natural for this. And I don't know how sharp it is. Let's have a look. It's not bad. So I'm going to add a bit of structure for this area. Now at the corners, I think it's a wide angle. So you see it's starting to soften a bit in the corners, just a bit. So I don't want to go too crazy with structure, because structure on softer areas, if we push it too hard, it's not going to look great. So I want to restrict it just to the sharpest areas, which is kind of around here. So we can afford a few points if you like. So now if we turn this layer off, we can see what it's doing, like so. But I want to restrict it just to this area to kind of make this area stand out a bit more. So once again, right click, clear mask, or invert would do the same because we've got a completely full mask. Grab my brush, check my settings. I'm going to turn the flow down again. Let's just go a bit bigger, and then now we can pop this sort of additional adjustments in the middle here, like so. Now the more I brush, the more it's going to come in. So if I feel this area should have less, and it probably should because the light is sort of coming in this direction and hitting this face, then this really shouldn't equal that. So if anything, this area should get the majority, like so. And once again, if I press M on the keyboard, you can see the mask. And we can just go a bit further over and down here. And if we want to see what that's doing, then we can turn this off and back on. So it's subtle, but it's warmer and brighter and a bit more contrasty in that area. Now sometimes a trick I do if I want to moderate the relationship between, you know, this mask and the rest of the shot is that we can duplicate it and then invert it. So if I make another layer, and I'm just going to call this opposite of waterfall, like so, or waterfall. Let's try that again. Opposite of waterfall. And I'm going to right click on it and say copy mask from waterfall. So I'm going to get exactly the same one. So it's just exactly the same. And then we're going to right click and say invert mask. So now essentially I've got the opposite, like so. So now if I want to, let's say, darken that a little bit, ever so slightly, and tiny bit of brightness, and maybe as an opposite I want to lift that a little bit, let's say like that, then we can sort of develop that relationship between the two, if you like, because this is the focal point, this weird and wonderful waterfall and cave and so on and so forth. You can fast switch between your layers here, by the way, so if you don't have a layers tool to hand, then I can easily jump between those two. You can also use a shortcut key as well. So you can use shortcut keys to go to background and go up and down the layer stack. So what are layers doing first of all? So if we hold down Alt on our keyboard and click on reset, then we can see before, so everything is relatively flat, and then after, like so. So bringing focus to that point, if you like. Okay, would I do anything else? Potentially, depending what your thought is on the sky, we could darken that down, but I think it would start to look fake. So I would be tempted to just leave that alone, to be honest. All right, let's have a look at your questions. Can I mention airbrush and auto mask? Yes. So it's not something I use a great deal. If you find a use for it, please let me know. So flow, if you remember, is a movement-based adjustment. So when you turn airbrush on, it then becomes a time-based adjustment. So like a spray can, if you like. So with airbrushes on, if I click and hold on the shot, then the mask will start at 0, if you like, and then it will spray up to its maximum opacity of 100. Now, if you have a low flow, it's like having a weedy spray can. If you have a high flow, it's like having a high-powered spray can. So I don't really know how to apply that usefully to photography, if you like. I think for illustration, it could be useful because it's a way of painting, if you like, but I don't quite see how I personally would use it, but that's what airbrush does. Auto mask will cut around a certain object, and there's some cases where that's useful, but most of the time, the more sort of accurate you make a mask in landscapes, the worse it looks, because it then becomes very obvious. Now, if I was doing interiors or architecture, I might want to mask very accurately around a window so I could moderate exposure. But it's very rare you need to do that on a landscape shot. Is there a way to save a preset group of layers? Eric was asking. Sadly not. You can't save layers as part of a style, which is a real shame, because I could see that would be very useful, because I would have my dodge and burn layer stack, for example, or like a style layer or something like that. So you're not the first person to suggest that, Eric, so maybe that's something we can do in the future. And it's not because we don't think it's a good idea, it's just, if you like, the internal wiring of Capture One to actually achieve that is a lot more complicated than you think, unfortunately. What's the purpose of adding a new layer without a mask? Well, you have to add a new layer to begin to draw a mask. Now, adding a new layer and then filling it straight away is just a way of drawing a mask. But there could be situations where I know that I just want to do a really quick and simple something, and I can do that without filling a layer, looking at the adjustments and deciding, I think, I know if I just draw a mask here, I can sharpen this a bit more or whatever. So, but generally I like to work with a filled layer because I can see what's going to happen. Pen pressure, if you have pen pressure switched on, that only relates to opacity, so that's kind of useless because you don't need pen pressure if you have flow control. Now, it would be nice if you could link pen pressure to size. That would be more useful, but right now pen pressure only links to opacity, which is kind of hopeless, unfortunately. Can you modify the white balance in a layer? Yes, you can. So for example, in this layer, I used the color balance tool, but we could also use the white balance if we wanted to. So if I just exaggerate the white balance here, then yes, you could do that on a layer as well, but similar kind of things. Can you do an HDR merge? No, you can't. So that has to be done in Photoshop, Affinity Photo, something like that. All right, and this would be good for a contrasty black and white, James says. Probably, actually. We're going to do a black and white, so have no fear. There we go. There's a black and white. But we are going to do a shot in black and white, which works quite well because it starts really super flat as well. All right, let's have a look. When you copy a mask from another layer, I saw that Cheryl, because she couldn't get in Q&A. Does it copy the mask and the adjustments? It just copies the mask, like so. I think you've got me guessing now. Let's not assume and test. So new layer, and if I say copy mask from waterfall, let's see. No, it's just the mask, not the adjustments, which is what I thought, but had to second guess myself there. All right, let's do another one. So let's do a black and white, actually, as James wants to see one. So we're going to do this one. Quick drink of water, sorry, because it starts off flat, and then we can see what the levels tool is all about as well. So for the other shots, they've had a relatively broad range from shadow to highlights. So we haven't really needed to play with the levels. But for this shot, now that's, oh, I just thought there was a huge spot on it, but it's something on my monitor just there. So I'm trying to spot something that doesn't exist. Okay, so for this one, it has a lot of missing information here. And this does attribute to the haze or flatness of the shot and so on. So there's a couple of things we can do. We can either drag in our shadow and highlight points manually. So you can see we can do that, and that gives us a particular result. Or we can say auto. Now when we're using auto, we've got two methods. So if we look in our preferences, we've got the RGB channel mode, and then we've got the red, green, blue channel mode. So if we choose RGB first of all and say auto, Capture One will move the shadow and highlight points into the composite RGB histogram. So essentially it's the same values, 21 and 179 for red, green and blue respectively. Really what's happening is that what we're asking Capture One to do, if we look at the bottom value, which is 179, we are saying map this value 179 to the one up the top, 255, which is why then your histogram is stretched out. And the contrast has improved because we've got a good range of tones all the way from shadows to highlights. Now the alternative method, let's reset that, is to change this to red, green and blue. And that will be an auto level for red, green and blue individually. And the benefit of that is if there can be like a strong color cast in the highlights or shadows, it can help correct that better and also remove some haziness as well. So if we say auto now, that does a pretty good job of adjusting that shot, considering we came from this and the only thing we've done is this, auto levels. We're pretty much 90% of the way there if we just wanted a nice color shot. So one other edit, if we just threw some clarity in there, we could almost move on to the next. I'd be perfectly happy with that edit, for example. Okay, but we want to do a bit more than that, and we thought about doing a black and white. So before we get to that, let's just make sure that we're happy with that slapdash clarity edit which went in. I think we are. And also we want to crop, so C for crop on my keyboard. And let's just bring up, get rid of that distracting rock in the front and a little bit of that. So that's going to be our crop for this, I think. So to convert this to black and white, relatively simple. We just turn on enable black and white like so. And these sliders probably are not going to have a huge amount of effects. Essentially, they control the density of each color tone. So there's a lot of red in the rock, I'm guessing. So if I pull red down to the left, you see that's going to get darker. If I bring it to the right, it's going to get lighter. So I don't really want to make it any darker or lighter, to be honest. So I'm probably going to leave it at 0. Yellow is going to have a similar thing because it's sort of an orangey tone. And the rest are probably going to have very little effect. A bit going on in the sky. So we could darken the sky down ever so slightly, and I doubt magenta is going to do anything either. So in this case, not a lot is going on. But we've got a good start point for our black and white. Now I want to add a bit of contrast, so let's try the contrast slider. It's okay, but it's a bit heavy-handed on the shadows. So a better alternative is going to use our curves instead. Now you've got two curve choices, RGB or Luma. RGB is almost what the contrast slider is doing, or it's actually somewhere in between. The difference between these two is that when we do a Luma contrast curve, the color is completely stable. So if I turn off black and white for a second, and then we play with an RGB curve, let's just draw a standard S curve, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but do you see how much the saturation has changed? It's really gone up a great deal. So if we reset that and go to Luma and throw in a similar S curve, you see the saturation change is 0. The contrast has gone up, but the color has not changed. So that's super useful if you want to keep the color stable. So again, if we turn our black and white conversion back on, I want to throw in a bit of contrast. Now we could argue now, well, doesn't matter about using RGB or Luma because it's a black and white image. That's not really the case, because if you've carefully set your sliders to be the right densities, and then you go in and use an RGB curve, that could also skew it as well. So for safety's sake, you could stick with Luma as well. So I want to have a bit more contrast, but I don't want the shadows to go too dark. So I'm going to just play around with a few control points like so. So I'm happy with that, I think. Now to see before and after, option, click, so before and after, just a little pop of contrast, but I'm just hanging on to my shadows like so. Okay, I might even put in some more clarity because I think it can take it. And structure wise, this is nice and sharp, so it probably doesn't need any more help, but we could get a couple of points and then it will print super nice. Okay, so there's two more things I want to do. We've got almost some light pooling in the middle here, and you see it's a little bit darker over here. So like our waterfall, I wouldn't mind exaggerating that a bit. And we've also got some paler lines on the wiggly bits of rock. I don't know what the technical term is, so maybe I might enhance those as well. But let's start with the sort of dodge and burn side of things. So I'm going to make a new field layer, and we're going to call this lighten, like so. And I want to brighten this area a bit. Now I could do this in a number of different ways. We could use exposure, we could use brightness if we only wanted the midtones, and we could also use curves. So I want to brighten this area just around here. Now if I hover the mouse on that, you can see we start to get an orange line dancing around on the curves. So that's showing me what that density is. So I want to lighten this area a bit, so I'm going to pin a point sort of here, then just raise that ever so slightly. And once again, it's a Luma curve, so it's not going to mess up my color to any extent. So that's brightening this area. Once again, I'm going to clear the mask. And the difference between these two, just to be clear, clear mask will just get rid of the mask. Invert the mask will turn the masked areas unmasked and the unmasked areas masked. So exactly that, in invert. So let's clear the mask. I'm going to grab my brush, and we've got a nice low flow once again, and I'm going to make this softer, and then I'm just going to throw a bit of light into this section here, like so, just to brighten that up a little bit. Now the opposite of that is to darken, of course. So we do the same thing. I'm going to make a new field layer, and we're going to call this darken. And once again, I want to darken this area down a bit, so that's kind of sitting in this area. So I'm going to throw in a control point there, like so. It's not going to be much. And then right click and clear that mask. And then I just want to darken down a couple of spots, like so. And maybe just a little bit along the front there, because I think it's a bit too bright. And then just this corner as well, like so. So now if we want to see what darken is doing, it's just taking those edges down over here a bit, and to see what lighten is doing, it's just brightening us up in the middle a bit. Now I've thought that these the wiggly bits, for want of a better geological expression, might be fun if they were brightened a bit as well. So what we might be able to get away with is using our existing lighten layer, because if I look at my mask, if I do Option M to see the grayscale mask, I'm not at my full opacity, so there's still some brightening to go there. So if I take my brush and make it really small, and then I can just probably brighten up just on here a bit more, like so, because I think there's some nice sort of light play going on. Now just so you get the idea of the scale of this, look, you can see a little power pile on there. So it's kind of hard to gauge just how massive this lump was, but it was a beast just sticking out in the middle of the desert. And so on. Now I could spend, you know, a long time doing this, but I'm sure that would be a bit tedious, but you get the idea. Kind of enhancing what's already there, if you like. Just almost a way of adding contrast by picking out some of those parts. So if we zoom back out and we turn our lighten layer off, then you can see before and after, like so. Now if we do option click on the whole thing, that's where we started, kind of a bit flat and dusty, and then this is where we are now. And if we look close up, it's super sharp, loads of detail in there. And again, if we see before and after, kind of almost looks a bit soft really, but it's just that the levels fixing really helped that more than anything to bring out all that detail. Alrighty, okay, now for the sky, do I want to fix that? I don't know, I don't think so. I think the focus is this, and I think if we had loads of cloud detail, maybe it would be a bit too much, but let's just throw in a quick linear gradient mask, something like that. And then is there a benefit to having some more clarity and maybe bringing the brightness down? Yeah, maybe a little bit, just a hint. Now again, the good thing about having this as layers, we can go back through our layer stack and use opacity to see if we got a bit carried away. So we could bring opacity down and then think, is that too much? Let's moderate it here. Did I go too dark? That's before and after. And then for my sky, that's nothing, and that's around there. So we can moderate, if you like, those choices as a final step. So I hope, James, that satisfied your need for a contrasty black and white. Let's have a look at the question. Oh, Randy says the wiggly bits are called alluvial fans. There we go. We are schooled. And then 2 weeks ago we learnt that the bit on the whale before the tail is called the flute. There you go. So that's 2 additional words I can add to my vocabulary. Working on black and white, can you use effects or filters like red or blue? We do have some presets, as you can see. So there's various different defaults, but if you wanted a blue filter, that would be cutting out blue light. So, or is that the opposite? I'm useless with that kind of stuff. But you'll find actually quite a few filters around, styles, or presets that try and emulate those kinds of things. I tend to do it rather unscientifically and see what lends best to the shot by playing with the sliders and see what the effect would be. Now in black and white, just seeing a question coming up, you can still use the color balance tool and also the master tab and the 3-way tap. So if you wanted to have just like a warm tone shot, we could actually use our, helps if you're on the right layer, David. We could use our master tab just to have like an overall warmer shot, or we could make our shadows colder, we could warm up the midtones, and we could have a little stab at making a split tone or a triple tone or as well. So you can still play around the color balance tool as well. And for grain wise, I wouldn't put grain on this because I think there's so much detail, I think it would be a shame to lose it. But the grain tool is really simple to use. Again, it's all visual experimentation. So we have 5 different grain types. So if I pick cubic grain, impact will be how visible the grain is, kind of like an opacity, if you like. And the granularity is how grainy it is. And again, there's no sort of right or wrong adjustments here. It's what you feel is best. And there's also some presets which you can play around with as well to see what the different kinds of adjustments do as well. Okay, but that's really easy to use. You can teach yourself how to use film grain, no problem whatsoever. Can the layer opacity be set to less than 100? Yes, that's a great tip. So when you make a new filled layer, before you do anything else, you can knock it down to around 70 is a good start point. And then when you're going through your layers at the end of it, you can decide which way to go. Do I want to do more or do I want to do less? So that's a really good tip, Joel, definitely. Okay, all right, let's squeeze one more in, hopefully. What should we do? So we did our black and white, we did that. Let's go for, this is going to make the laptop roll over and die because it's 150 megapixels, but it's a nice sort of exercise. So fingers crossed for laptop, and we should be good to go. So first of all, I'm going to use the Keystone tool, because we're like looking at architecture. When we look up at something, it falls over. So let's make this El Capitan, I believe it is, a bit prouder. So on my vertical keystoning, we're going to go this way just to make it pop out a little bit more. Now for cropping, I think I'm going to get rid of that tree because it's bothering me. It's a bit sort of distracting, like so. And also rotation wise, I think I just want to spin it to the left ever so slightly, like that. So I'm happy with that composition. Now we've got the nice sunlight hitting the side here, so that's something we really want to focus on. So we could brighten that up, but then we're going to lose saturation, so I don't really want to do that. So we could carefully darken down the surroundings to some extent, but without blocking up our shadows and it looking unpleasant. So first of all, let's look at our levels. If we say auto, there's a little bit we can do. I am going to add some clarity as well, and this is definitely going to be punch because we want that fire to sing, as it were. It's not actually fire, it's just Paul, who took this shot. He was on the webinar this morning. It's on El Capitan, but I can't remember the technical name for this area, but it only happens on rare occasions or at the right time of year where we get the sun hitting the side of the face like so. So we've got a bit more clarity, and we could probably afford some structure because it's nice and sharp. So let's just chuck in a few points of structure as well. No harm in that going over the whole shot because all of it looks in focus. Now I want to give sort of kudos to this area, so I think what we can do is a radial mask. So let's draw a radial gradient mask. So where I start drawing, whoops, excuse me, let's zoom out again. Where I start drawing, it's going to draw out from the center. Now if I hover over the middle line, I can rotate, and if I go in the middle, I can move it. And unlike the linear mask, it has to be symmetrical. So the fall off is always going to be 0, 50, 100, and we can't do anything about that, unfortunately. So let's position that. Once again, if we press M on my keyboard, you can see the mask that it's making. So what do I want to do? I want to just kind of darken it down a little bit, so not by too much. And I'm going to use brightness because I don't want the shadows to start to get mucky. And what about if I desaturated? Would it give more, might give a bit more sort of trick that it's more saturated in the middle. So like so. So I think that's pretty good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same trick. So this is our radial on the outside. And we're going to make a new layer, and we're going to say copy mask from radial outside. So that's the same. And then we're going to say invert mask. So I should have just the middle, but I could still edit it if I wanted to, which is really super nice as well. But those two masks mesh perfectly now. So now in the middle here, what I will do is boost up the saturation a bit, which looks good. And if I wanted to, we could actually pick in the color editor just that color tone, and then I might just darken it slightly as well so it's a bit richer, like so. Now finally, if I go back to my background layer, we've got a hint of the blue sky. Do we want to do anything with that? It might ruin the shot, but let's try. So if I pick the blue sky, and right now you'll see the little dot, that's the exact color tone that I picked. The triangle, if you like, the wedge, that's the range of colors that it's going to affect. Now as a shortcut, I can hit this button here, just at the bottom of the color editor, and that will span the entire saturation range of any blue tone that matched my pick color. So that's a good shortcut. So now, as I said, it might ruin the shot, but I can make it a bit darker and then bump up the saturation of that as well. Actually, that makes it look less muddy. So if I boost up the saturation. So I think, going back to my layer stack, we can maybe afford to make that a bit darker once more. There we go. And finally, if I fix my crop, there's a bit of tree poking in, kind of bothering me. There we go. That's nice and cleaner. So what do we do if we hold our Alt key down and click on Reset? Then we can see before and then after, like so. Nice and simple. But again, a few little tweaks just to bring out the focus, which is the fire in the middle. Not too much at the expense of everything else, but I think hopefully Paul will be happy with the edit that I made. Yes, James, it is El Capitan. But I can't remember what they call this phenomenon, but it only happens every now and then. Okay, let's have a look at the last few questions and then we shall call it a day. All right. Okay. Yes, Cheryl, there is a Luma selection. Now this morning I did actually use the Luma mask on here, but it wasn't that useful, to be honest. But if there's time, we'll have a quick look at that in a minute. But essentially any mask, so regardless of whether it's a radial mask or one you've drawn by hand or a filled mask, you can apply a Luma range to it. So if we do Option M, so that's the mask is the white area, and if we say Luma range, we can then apply a luminosity constraint to that, which is essentially your 0 to 255 range. Now it will take a while to number crunch and figure it out because this is a big image and it's a radial mask, but while we let that whir away, we'll answer some other questions. Oh, there we go. So you can see now, based on the tones of the image, the mask has been modified. So the white areas are ones that's going to be masked and the black areas are the ones that's not going to be touched. So our radial mask now, if we actually just say apply to that and bring it back out. So now my radial is only affected, if you like, this area because it was just the shadows. It now avoided the blue sky. So it's really powerful. It's not something which you think, oh, I must use Luma masks because they're really cool on every single shot. Sometimes it's really useful and it can save time. Other times it's not necessary. But it's just something to think about, another tool that you can use. Okay, let's look at the Q&A. Let's have a look. Can I show the best way of interacting with Affinity Photo back and forth? Probably not now as we've run out of time, but that might be a good webinar for the future. But essentially right click, edit with, choose Affinity Photo. That will go to Affinity Photo, do your stuff. It will make a TIFF file or whatever you choose next to your raw file, so you'll see it pop up down here underneath. The only thing you might have to do with Affinity, once you've done what you need to do in Affinity, is when you save out the file, if it doesn't update in Capture One, like the preview doesn't change, you might have to say regenerate previews, and then it will pop back to how it is. But it's as simple as that. That's all you have to do. Let's have a look. In a previous webinar you showed how to use the focus mask. The preview quality I get is pixely. The only thing you can change for the focus mask is the threshold, so how critical it is. So you shouldn't really be seeing anything else So I'd say if you have an issue, just drop a note to support and then they can have a look for you. Is the webinar in low resolution? Nope. I'm just looking on my broadcast monitor. No, it's at full HD, so it should be super crisp. So, and the broadcast is still going out in HD, so it's not a problem on my end, Raphael. So perhaps it could be a browser issue. So try a different browser maybe. There seems to be a bit magenta in the greyish clouds. Could that be desaturated? Yeah, again, I'd say the color balance tool is kind of a handy thing. So this is probably a mid-tone. So if you wanted to go to whatever, the opposite, we could pretty much change the clouds. We could actually warm them up. That might look nice. Or we could make them colder to match the blue and so on. So if you go to the opposite of the color cast in the color balance tool, then you can correct for that. So that's a really overlooked thing that the color balance tool can do, is to correct a color cast. So if your shadow is too cold, go to the opposite. If your shadow is too warm, go to the opposite, and so on. So have a look at that, James. In the thumbnails, can you show file size? No, it's not possible, I'm afraid. The only place to do that would be in the info window, and then you should, actually I don't even know if it's in the info window. I'm going to call myself out as a liar there, but no, it's not possible as far as I can tell. No, so otherwise it's going to be a right click and say show in Finder or Explorer if you're on Windows, and then that will pop open a Finder window, and then you can see the file size. So this one is a whopper, as it's from 150 megapixels. Why does Capture One block copying GPS data? It shouldn't. If your camera records GPS data, then it should show up in the metadata. So if you're not seeing it, then let us know, because there's no reason for us to block it. So if you have a GPS device on your camera, or you're adding the GPS data in another way, then it should show up in the metadata tool. So if we just close this down, there should be GPS here, like so. So it shouldn't be blocked. So just, again, tell support if it is, and then I'm sure that's something we can fix. Does it matter if we store files on our external and edit our catalog on internal? No, these are actually all on an external hard drive, what we've done today, and the catalog has been internal. So no problem whatsoever. You can't copy GPS data from one photo to another. True, that's probably more of a feature request. But again, any feature request, send it to support, because we want to hear about it for sure. Alrighty, I think as we're running out of time, that probably covers the common questions, I would say. As I said, this is being recorded, of course. So you will get an email notification. It's automatic. So as soon as the recording is ready, an email goes straight out to your email address, and you'll be able to watch it straight away. But recordings always go up on the Learning Hub in the same place, learn.captureone.com. By default, and you'll see the upcoming webinars are sticky along the top, so you can always see when new webinars are coming out as well. So many thanks for your time today and interest. I know it's a big ask for you to spend an hour, so appreciate you doing that, and I hope to see you all again soon. So have a great rest of your Thursday wherever you may be, and see you soon. Take care. Bye now.